So let's go ahead and start creating the fire. So the first thing that we want to do for our fire is we're going to create a new Niagara system. So we're going to right click, and then we're going to go to the Niagara system here. It's going to open our template setup and stuff like that. We're going to select one from the emitter library. So let's go ahead and hit next. And in here, you can select the fountain, you can select empty. Now, it's up to you if you want to start empty or with a fountain or whatever else you want to do. Let's go ahead and start with a fountain very quick. And let's hit plus there and hit finished. All right, and this one we're going to call it our NS, so for Niagara system. And in here we're going to put our torch. Okay, and then I'm going to put a flame, for example, just a name, just to have a name. All right, or torch fire. So now that we have this, you're going to go ahead and double click on it, and you're going to notice that immediately you have already a specific emitter in there. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to rename this emitter immediately, and I'm going to call this emitter is going to be my base, my fire base. So let's go ahead and take this fountain, and we're going to call it any for the emitter, Niagara emitter, and this is going to be my fire base. So, okay. So now that I have this, there's a couple things that we need to start tweaking, right? So it doesn't look anything like fire. That's the first thing. There's a couple behaviors there that we don't want and stuff like that. So the first thing is I'm going to start looking at the different setups. First, we're going to be using a CPU emitter property. That's perfectly fine. And in here, in our emitter state, what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to go make sure that I have it set up to a specific infinite. So I want the fire to be infinite loop and then the duration. Remember, I'm not going to go too in depth into every aspect of this. You could read more about each individual area. What I want to do is to get to a location quickly. Now, the goal of the effect is to make sure that we could play it at 60 frames a second, right? And cinematics will be at least 30 frames a second, but we don't want any stutters and things like this. So the goal is to first get the functionality and the emitter looking correct, and then is the look. So that's very important to understand. It doesn't matter what effect you're creating. If it doesn't work within the engine, it's useless. It could be as cool as you can, but it's useless if you can't see it correctly. So that's the first thing that I'm going to do. I'm going to set up that spawn rate, the loop duration to 2. That's going to last 2 seconds. So you're going to see it at the bottom here in your timeline. The next thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to click on the top here so we could see all the settings like this. And I'm going to take the spawn rate and I'm going to lower it down to, let's go about 15 in here. So you notice that we have less amount of particles. It's going to be a little bit more optimal. And let me go ahead and turn off the background for now. I'm going to go to a preview set and turn that off in the show environment. Then I'm going to go back to selection so I'm able to work with my current area. So you could actually collapse all these areas if you want to. It makes it a lot easier to work with. Okay. So the next thing that I want to do is, now that I have that, the next thing is I want to check my initialization of the particles. Okay. So here's what happens when the particle initially spawns from that emitter. So I want to control a little bit the lifetime of the particle, what it's going to be the minimum and the maximum. So in this case, let's go ahead and give it about 1. So it's going to be 1 second in there. And then the maximum, let's give it less than this, 1.6. We want that fire to die off pretty quickly in that scenario. So it's gonna go away pretty fast. We really don't need mask, so we could turn that off. That's part of the fountain preset and stuff like that. So we really don't need that to work with. Color, we could keep it. We could use it later if we need to. We probably won't. Now, the next thing that we're going to work with is this area right here where it says sprite size. We need to control the size of the sprite for sure. Now, we're using our sprite render, and that's what you see down on the top here and at the bottom here. There's different type of renders inside Niagara. There's light render that we're going to be using to emit interactive lighting. That means every particle is emitting a light. We got mesh to use meshes, right, as particles, right? They get emit from the emitter. We got ribbon to create those interactive like little loops and things like that you will see. It's a ribbon, a beam, and things like that. And then we have the sprite render. That's what we're doing. It's a sprite facing the camera. So now that we have this, pardon for all the other noises around, is during the pandemic, it's hard to record everything. It's family and all of it. So essentially, now that we have this, what we're going to do is we're going to control a little bit more on that initialized particle, the sprite size. And this is where our attributes will come to play and our variables, the parameters, the variables, everything that we're going to be working with. So the first thing is I need to do like a little dynamic attribute here. So I need to do a dynamic input. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to change this. So instead of being like 10 and 10, I don't want the particle to be exactly the same all the way through. So what I want to do is instead of having to control both sides at the same time, this is not like the spark. I want to control both with one single number. So the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to change these two values, the x and y, to one single float value. Okay, and we call that vector 2D from float. Okay, so float just means that is a number that could go with decimal spaces, right, with in-betweens instead of integer. If it was vector 2D from integer, it will be just 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. There won't be any in between. So that's what we're going to do here. So if we want a one single value, we're going to go ahead in the top here. We're going to do, you could do dynamic inputs and you could search for it. It will be this one at the bottom. These are the two that we mostly use. Actually, these three, we use it the most. The range, that gives you a range. The curve allows you to control everything based on a curve. And then the vector from float is just one number. So let's go ahead and click on that, vector from float, and you notice that this change right here, it gives you this little icon that is telling you now it's being controlled by that specific attribute. So now you see one number. So if I put here, I want the particle to be 10 in size, it will be in x and y, 10, right? So that's the next stage. So I want the fire to be pretty big. So I'm going to go ahead and say 30. And that means that because we're going to go ahead and use a texture to drive this, it's going to be pretty big. So if you want it bigger, it will be bigger. But we're creating, remember, the base. So we don't want those particles to be emitted high up like this. Okay, so the next thing that I want to do is I want to pretty much add a velocity and cone that we already have. And we have a sphere location as well in there. To control it. We could actually shut these off so you could see what they're doing. Okay, I'm going to turn all these off as particle state. You notice how the particle is actually reacting. So for this, I'm just going to add another element, and we're going to add velocity and cone. Okay. So it's going to give you an error, and it's going to say, you need some dependencies for this to work. And the dependencies that it's telling you is this little guy right here. It says sword, false design, velocity. We need to be able to have that because as we are adding velocity, we need to be able to solve those after the fact, right? So we could get the actual information. Now you see that there's no gravity or anything like that. We shut all that off. Okay, so now that we have tweaked these elements in the initialized particle, again, what happens when the particle initially comes out of that scenario, the next thing that we're going to do is we're going to go to the velocity here. And in this velocity, we're going to tweak some settings as well. If you notice at the top here, it says range from float. If I reset that, you're going to notice that it changes back to that velocity strength. This is like a normal float value. This one doesn't have x and y. It's just one vector. So what we want here is we need to have a uniform range. We need to give a minimum and a maximum so we can get some randomness to that emission. So for this, what I'm going to do is it was already there. I just removed it. So I'm going to say range. So we could actually do that. So use range from float. You see it's the same default value that we had before. But I'm going to give it a speed, 0.6. And then here we're going to give it like a 20. So it starts moving. So you notice now it stays very low, like the actual base of the fire will be. Okay. And the next thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to go jump back into the environment here. I'm going to drag and drop this just very quick to see what it's doing, because it's very important at this stage to see the scale of what is happening. Right? If I go too big, then we have a problem, right? So the problem is that in here, this viewport, there's no reference, right, of how big or how small something really is. So by dragging it into the world, you're able to kind of judge a little bit better how big or how small it will be. All right, so going back to this guy, now we're working with that velocity. The next thing is let's give it a little bit of a cone angle of, let's say around 10. All right. So it doesn't spread that much. If you go really high, again, exaggerate it, you see how it's spreading wide, right? If you go, let's say 1,000, you see how it's spreading now sideways. So essentially, I'm going to go low because I want the torch to go upwards, right? Again, a simple effect could help you understand or help you in the process of understanding all these things. The other thing that I'm going to do is the axis. I'm going to make sure that it's facing upwards. In Unreal, Z is up, okay? Different than Maya, the Y is up. So I want everything to go upwards. We're going to keep the coordinates local, that's fine. And the velocity distribution of 0.75, that's the default now. Okay, and you sometimes are going to see this little guy right here, and this is to check if there's other attributes that we can modify or other variables within the module, parameters in this case. There's so many different names for everything. All right, so moving on, the next thing that I want to do is add a little bit of acceleration to this, right? We need it a little bit, just a little bit. So let's go ahead and click on this, and let's add an acceleration force. Okay. And let's go ahead and say this is going to pop up. You got to go say fix the issue, and you're going to notice that in order for this to work, we need to apply an initial force. Again, all this is happening in the spawn. All right. So what we're going to do is we're going to give that initial acceleration to this, and we're going to give just a small number. Let's give it about 810. It's just going to make it go a little bit quicker. All right. And that's perfectly fine. Nothing to tweak in the acceleration force. We're good. Now let's go into the particle update. So the particle update section is what is going to happen after the particle gets emitted. We call that particle tick. Every frame, what is happening to those particles? All right. So in this case, we're going to start with the basics. Yes, we want to kill the particle when its lifetime is done. If you spread to the side, you're going to see it. Okay. So when this lifetime over here is done, what happens to that particle? That's the particle state. Remember, those two need to live with one another. If you don't have this one, you can't take advantage of the lifespan or anything like that. The next thing that we want is let's work with a little bit more of the forces. Let's go ahead and turn on the drag. Okay. And we already had it there, but I want to go back and make sure that I have a good variation there. So with acceleration, we added speed, but we don't want the flame to be that high in our base. So we're going to reduce, we're going to keep the speed, right? That acceleration, but the drag is going to force it to either speed that quick, but the drag is going to force it to stay lower. Okay. So 1.5, let's go with that. And you notice it's emitting quickly. You don't see it yet because of the fire and stuff like that. We don't have the texture yet. But you notice how it's still emitting quicker because of the initial acceleration, but it's dragging down. It's not going that high. And you could turn it on and off by clicking on this little guy, right? And that's what gives us our base. This is the attribute that we will change later on to create the different stages, the top, the middle, and so on and so forth. All right, so the next thing is the scale color. And what this is going to allow us to do is to be able to take the texture. We need this here, of course, because we're going to take the texture that we generated, the shader, or the material in the case of Unreal, is the same thing. And we're going to be able to, based on a curve, control its transparency. So this curve allows me to control based on the lifetime from 0 to 1, right? So this is the lifetime of the particle, not the lifetime in the sense of how many frames I have in the sequence. No, it's from where the particle got emitted to where the particle dies. This is what happens here. It's already preset for you if you use the fountain, right? If not, we're using a float from curve to control the alpha. Okay, I'm going to delete it here by clicking here and resetting it. You don't have to do that. It's just for the purpose of showing it. And the way that we think about this is logically. I want the particle to fade off of its lifetime, but I also want the particle to start not immediately, so it's not a pop. I want the particle to start also with 0, go immediately to high, and then come back down to 0. Okay, and that's how we're going to approach this, right? And if you think about that, and you think about that logic, essentially, that's what we're trying to accomplish. And the only way of accomplishing that is not with two values, is we having multiple values. So curves allow us to have multiple values over the lifetime of that particle. It's not A or B, it's A, B, C, D, F, G, everything in between until we hit Z, right? So in this case, that's what we're going to do here. So thinking about that, what we're going to do is I want to adjust it based on a curve. That way we got a subtle fall off. So float from curve. So float means a floating value. So 1.1, 1.2, 1.3, not an integer. And from curve, and that's this pretty much. So now we have that control. So you see, we went back to it. We're just digging into what is happening. This controls the alpha. That means the transparency. So I'm going to start with a particle adding a value right here by holding down the shift and clicking in the curve. Now we can move this value in the middle. All right, and I'm going to move that value. Let's put it back into 0.25. I want to start like there, and then the value, I'm going to say 1. So it's full right at 0.25 in the lifetime of the particle. We might have to change that, of course. Now, in time 0, that means at the beginning of that particle, I want the value not to be 1. I don't want it to be fully visible. I want it 0. So it's going to start like transparent. If you notice, all of a sudden, it was a little transparent. So it doesn't look like it's popping immediately into the setup. So I'm going to move this guy a little bit closer. I like to move it by, you could do it manually, but then the values are very random. So I'm going to go 0.05, and so it starts and immediately becomes hot. And then right here, I want another value high above that area. So let's go ahead and hold down Shift, create another value here. I want to stay in 1 all the way to a specific range. And I want to put that value right in 1 again here, but and this one, 1. Okay, so but then on the value in between, I want to go, maybe I want to fall it off a little bit quicker. So maybe let's go, instead of 0.5, let's go 0.45, just a little bit before that. And then I like a soft transition. So I'm going to right click on that. And I'm going to say auto. So it kind of creates this little leap right there. So it kind of falls off nice and naturally. This one, the same idea, auto. And then we're going to have a curve. Now, we got to be very careful with this, because what happened there was when I do that, you notice that it goes upwards, right? So I'm going to go take this. It's going a value above 1. Okay, so I'm going to take those two values right there. Now, if you really don't want that to happen, you could just use a break, and the break allows you to just keep it, the same idea. I will break it. And the same as animation curves. You're breaking your weights and stuff like that. So you don't have to be perfect on that. You click on these two to kind of collapse everything. As long as you're pretty close, it should be fine. If you go above a value of 1, there's no problem on that. Don't worry about it. But I usually always tend to clamp the alpha. But in this case, clamping means restricting the alpha to 0, 1. Alpha should always be from 0 to 1. That's pretty much it, no matter what you do. So let's do a little bit of cleanup here, and in the next video what we're going to do is we're going to start with layering the other fire effects by creating the center of the fire, the top of the fire, and pretty much the materials and everything that we need for this section as well.